Some people in Athens would not know whether Abuja is a flower, a fruit, or a city.
It is of course the federal capital of Nigeria, built in the 1980s, and growing nicely since.
Little news reaches from Sub-Saharan Africa, mostly negative and fragmented.
They reinforce the established stereotypes and preconceptions.
Sub-Saharan Africa consists of 51 countries.
The largest is Nigeria with 180 million people.
The smallest St. Helena with 4,000.
The first two countries, Nigeria and Ethiopia, have 30% of the total population.
The first 5 have half the population.
And the first 10 2/3.
We often get a piece of news about a small country, and we project it to the entire region.
Ebola is a typical example.
The epidemic hit 3 small countries.
Together they have 2.5% of the total population of the subcontinent.
But Ebola was seen as a Pan-African epidemic. Tourists and businessmen
cancelled trips to destinations thousands of kilometers away,
fearing the deadly virus.
In the same way, a military coup takes place in a small country, and we think the entire SSA is run
by dictators.
The 10 largest countries that have 2/3 of the population of Sub-Saharan Africa
have elected governments. They are democracies.
Some of them are weak democracies, with serious faults and deficiencies, but they are not dictatorships. Their governments were not born out of a military coup.
SSA, Sub-Saharan Africa, Black Africa is going well, going much better than it did 20 or 40 years ago.
The images and impressions we all have in our minds come from a previous phase.
Peace and development have been absent from Sub-Saharan Africa for a long time.
Great progress has been made recently on both fronts.
There are still many conflicts.
In Nigeria, Boko Haram and its persecutors are said to have killed 15,000 people in the last few years.
These are terrible numbers.
They are nevertheless insignificant compared to what happened in the past.
There is a geometrical difference between today and the 1980s or 90s.
Thousands instead of millions.
Peace has made spectacular progress.
Today's conflicts concern smaller populations and are less intense. The typical Sub-Saharan Africans of today are not fighting some war. They are at home, or at their work, they bring up their children peacefully, and their countries are making good progress.
They are as far and as untouched by the tragedies that afflict specific areas as we are.
For a few decades after the end of colonial rule, the economic condition of Sub-Saharan Africa was getting worse. This trend changes around the year 2000.
Sub-Saharan Africa enters a phase of stabilization and growth.
It remains to this day the poorest region of the world.
But the distance from the so-called First World is diminishing instead of increasing.
This has to do with the crisis in the First World, but also with fast growth in SSA.
Europe has recently had 0 or negative growth.
Some Sub-Saharan economies are growing at 7, 8 or 10% per year.
The IMF projects an average rate of growth for the entire region of 5% per year.
Such was the strength of a recent building boom in Angola, that 100,000 Portuguese emigrated there.
We are of course talking about very poor countries.
90% of the population of the Democratic Republic of Congo have no electricity.
However, the construction of a 3rd dam on the River Congo, which is expected to start in 2016,
will provide electricity to South African factories
and the mines of Katanga, and to a few million citizens.
It is part of a series of dams that one day
may provide electricity to 1/2 of SSA and be connected to Europe.
Electricity will transform the Congo and the entire continent.
Is the current growth just and equal for all?
No.
Not between countries and not within them.
Per capita GDP, 2013. $400, 1,200, 2,600, 11,500, 23,600, 55,400.
Notice the scale of inequality between countries. Norway has more than twice the per capita product of Greece.
Tanzania has 3 times the per capita product of Congo-Kinshasa.
Nigeria 6.5 times.
And South Africa 29 times.
Let's get rid of the idea that all countries of Black Africa,
are more or less the same.
all European countries are more or less the same.
All sub-Saharan countries
Have a section of their population in extreme poverty that simply doesn't exist in Europe.
and this means hunger, disease, illiteracy.
There is, however, progress.
On a global scale, progress in the last 30 years has been spectacular.
The percentage of the very poor that have been living on less than €1 a day was more than 40% of the total population of the planet in 1981.
And has dropped to less than 20% by 2008.
However, this global trend hides important regional differences.
This diagram by the World Bank shows more detail.
This is Eastern Asia, which contains China. It started with nearly 80% of its population in extreme poverty in 1981.
And dropped to less than 20% by 2008.
This is Sub-Saharan Africa. It was in a better condition than China in 1981.
The percentage of poverty increased in the 1980s, stabilized in the 1990s, and is dropping since.
The percentage, not the absolute figures, not yet.
The latest figures show, unfortunately, that the number of hungry people is still rising in Sub-Saharan Africa.
From 176 million to 214.
But the percentage of the hungry in the total population is dropping from 33 to 24%.
From 1/3 to less than a quarter.
This UN diagram shows maternal mortality per 100,000 births.
Each group of columns is a region. Each column is a year. 1990, 95, 2000, 2005, 2010.
The last group of columns on the right is Sub-Saharan Africa.
It has more deaths than any other part of the world, but they are dropping.
They are diminishing.
In education also, SSA has the worst results in the world, but is improving.
In 1990, only 52% of children completed primary education. In 2010, 69%.
Therefore, Sub-Saharan Africa is not well.
But is going well. It is making progress. It is moving in the right direction.
This is also shown by progress towards the Millennium Goals.
SSA will not achieve many of the Millennium Goals by 2015, but a little later.
The overall delay of SSA has something to do with its very rapid population increase,
as the spectacular successes of China have something to do with population control.
SSA started with less than 200 million inhabitants in 1950, employed in the primary sector in the large majority,
and is approaching today 1 billion inhabitants.
For a long time, the annual increase in agricultural production was slower than the population increase, and many countries resorted to imports and to food aid.
Today, food production is increasing faster than population.
This FAO diagram shows the total increase in food production with the year 2000 as base year equal to 100.
By 2012, total production had increased 45%.
Per capita production only 11%.
3/4 of the increased production were absorbed by the increasing population.
Despite its increased production, the primary sector cannot employ the additional 800 million people
that SSA has added to its population since 1950.
So there is massive unemployment and poverty.
And an increasing proportion of the rapidly increasing population is emigrating to the cities and to other sectors of the economy.
In 2010, an influential report
showed that recent African growth was coming from many sectors.
Resources were important, but growth did not come only from resources.
The largest city of Sub-Saharan Africa is
Lagos of Nigeria.
Here converge all the dreams and all the nightmares of Black Africa.
Lagos of our dream is now. Nothing you are looking for that you cannot find here is the place to be.
What are they saying?
The city of our dreams.
There is nothing you cannot find in Lagos.
This is the place to be.
What is this enthusiasm? The rich are certainly having a good time in Nigeria, and most of them are gathered in Lagos.
However, 1 in 4 economically active Nigerians is unemployed.
1 in 2 amongst the young.
The people in this stadium are applicants for a few vacancies at the immigration service.
The Nigerian economy is creating 1 million new jobs a year in a country that is adding each year 4 million inhabitants to its population and 2 million to its labor force.
These numbers are correct as an order of magnitude. They are on purpose very approximate to indicate the uncertainty about their accuracy, especially in relation to the so-called informal economy.
Narrowly defined, the informal economy concerns illegal activities such as prostitution, drugs, or the smuggling of oil.
A wider definition includes many legal activities.
In the primary sector and in rural areas, a significant share of GDP is often self-consumed or exchanged away from formal markets and state supervision.
At the same time, informal networks, sometimes with religious or tribal affiliations, often provide medical, educational and even financial services.
In the cities, an army of self-employed, underemployed constitutes the informal economy, which is often directly linked to the formal one, distributing and maintaining its products.
In this wider sense, the informal sector is said to produce nearly 60% of the official GDP.
At the same time, it is said that the size of the Nigerian economy could be significantly larger if all informal activities could be measured accurately,
and that unemployment is both larger and smaller than the official one.
In other words, there is massive informal part-time employment or underemployment.
High unemployment, rapid urbanization, and fast, uneven and unjust growth.
In a context of marked divisions between classes, regions, tribes, languages and religions,
and the destruction of bad and good traditional structures and customs,
generate terrible tensions.
Now, then they compare us to Greece. My friend, Greece does not have cocoa. Greece does not have diamonds. Greece does not have gold. Greece does not have oil. So why are they comparing us to Greece? 100,000 naira. If they want to do like, if it is truly democracy of the people, by the people, for the people, then let the president show himself. Let him bring his salary to the minimum wage.
We are not saying that there should be no election. Our political elites are allergic to democracy as well as neurotic in their pursuit of power. Nations fail as a result of weak institutions. Our military has not been able to protect the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Nigeria because its orientation was mercenary. It was meant to protect the ruling class. Our judiciary has been weak in settling election controversies because of corruption and nepotism. Politics is seen as a source of wealth, an avenue to reap back profit from the state. The state is more or less like a privatized entity where the so-called investors, the political godfathers, must reap their profit.
The British, they came down to Nigeria to mumble-jumble us. Now, when you try to bring people of different cultures and language and try to put them together as a nation, what you get is chaos.
Boko Haram has become a household name in Nigeria. Hundreds of thousands of people in the north have been displaced, and there is no guarantee that they will get the opportunity to exercise their right to vote.
Ethnic agitations, which seem to be the in thing in Nigeria today, do not necessarily mean that Nigeria will break up. Everybody wants to be heard. Nigeria is a multi-ethnic community, having over 250 ethnic groups and over 510 languages. The only way to neutralize the tension between these ethnic groups in terms of leadership is by elections. Afghanistan, regardless of the Taliban, conducted a successful election. The United States wants Nigeria to win its war on terror, and it's prepared to assist Nigeria with every means possible.
The Nigeria we see today has thrived despite threats. Even with the threat of the secession of Biafra, we still survived as one Nigeria. Of course, the threat should not be underestimated, but the existence of a threat has a positive, cognitive, and psychological effect to wake up Nigerians. Your vote is your right, it's your responsibility, and it's your power. And remember, with great power comes great responsibility. Thank you.
Are you aware of any alternative that has been provided to elections? So far as I know, elections are the best system of governance for any race under mankind. It has been proven and tested from its origin in Greece to its modern entrenchment in the United States of America. We've been practicing democracy for the last 14 years. Yes, we are not perfect. Yes, it has its dooms. But however, we are practicing it and we are making progress, definitively.
But the topic of this debate is whether the 2015 election will make and not mar Nigeria, and not for us to provide an alternative to this. The 2015 election will mar Nigeria. Thank you.
Wrong. The 2015 presidential election has been a success.
The eyes of the world were focused on us to see if we could vote in a peaceful way and carry out a representative election in an orderly manner. We have proven to the world that we are a people who have embraced democracy and a people who seek a government by, for, and of the people.
There were many difficulties. The election had to be postponed from the 14th of February to the 28th of March. Boko Haram did attack some polling stations, and voting had to be extended to a second day in some areas. But it was deemed free and fair, and the result was accepted by incumbent President Goodluck Jonathan, who congratulated his opponent President-elect Muhammadu Buhari. Not only is a Muslim replacing a Christian, and a northerner a southerner, but a new party has come to power, for the first time since 1999. Ordinary people, and the Nigerian Stock Exchange, were ecstatic the following day. Washington, London and the European Union had strongly encouraged Nigerians to respect the democratic process. President Obama had directly addressed the people of Nigeria.
Today I want to speak directly to you, the people of Nigeria. All Nigerians must be able to cast their votes without intimidation or fear. So I call on all leaders and candidates to make it clear to their supporters that violence has no place in democratic elections, and that they will not incite, support, or engage in any kind of violence before, during, or after the votes are counted.
Nigeria is today the largest country of Africa, with 180 million inhabitants, and the biggest economy of SSA with a total GDP of approximately 400 billion euros.
Lagos is the largest city of Nigeria and of SSA.
The population of Nigeria is increasing by 2.5% a year, and that of the city of Lagos by 4.7%. It is nearly 14 million in 2015, and is expected to reach 18 million by 2025.
Some Lagos state officials estimate the current population of the wider area to be 22 million and predict that within a few decades Lagos will be the third largest urban area of the planet after Tokyo and Bombay.
It is the economic nerve center of Nigeria. It produces 20 to 25% of the country's product and distills its dynamism, but also its enormous problems.
The phrase "this is the place to be" describes the reality. Lagos is a population magnet that attracts poor and rich alike.
In Africa in general, and in Lagos in particular, an urban middle class is rising as sectors other than natural resources are developing.
Only 14% of Nigeria's 2013 GDP came from natural resources.
Nevertheless, Nigeria still has the characteristics of an underdeveloped country, with a large agricultural sector, little manufacturing, and significant exports of raw resources.
If, however, rather than the sources of GDP, we examine the sources of GDP growth, we discern a restructuring of the Nigerian economy.
Agriculture with 22% of GDP generated only 9% of growth, and resources with 14% of GDP generated only 5% of growth. On the other hand, manufacturing with 7% of GDP contributed 14% of growth, and insurance, finance, and construction generated, each one of them, 7% of growth. And finally, trade with 17% of GDP gave 20% of growth.
Within various, which also have a significant contribution to growth, a very small sector distinguishes itself with 1% of GDP and 4% of growth. Entertainment, which means mainly Nollywood, has explosive growth.
However, even though the dependence of the Nigerian economy on oil, and of SSA more generally on natural resources, have declined,
the dependence of government revenues remains high.
70% of the revenues of the budget of Nigeria,
according to the Minister of Finance,
come from oil.
So the falling price of oil will hurt the Nigerian economy and will reduce its rate of growth.
But it will not reverse it, as it often happened before the year 2000,
when GDP was going up and down from year to year according to the price of oil.
DHL announced recently that its fastest growing markets were in Africa.
What does this tell us?
It says that post offices have serious problems in Africa.
But it also shows that a widening professional and business class
needs better postal services and can pay for them.
Lagos, according to Fitch, is the key driver of the Nigerian economy.
And 80% of this economy is made up of services, construction, transport and manufacturing.
Who participates in this fast-growing modern economy?
Very approximately, about 1/3 of the population of Lagos.
The remaining 2/3 are poor or very poor, and sometimes are having difficulty even finding food.
Nevertheless, poor immigrants continue to come,
because realities and expectations are better than in their place of origin.
A university study of the last decade found that in the poor neighborhoods of Lagos,
street food contains 150 milligrams of lead per gram of food.
In the mid-income neighborhoods, 75 milligrams.
And in rich neighborhoods,
0.2 milligrams.
According to the World Health Organization,
0.001 is the acceptable maximum.
Same situation with house water.
Heavy metals, bacteria and bad microorganisms show great preference for the poor, but rarely leave the rich untouched.
Wow. Can you see that the tap water we drink?
Poverty, high population density and traffic congestion go together with polluted, unsafe food and water.
The same study, however, showed that 72% of immigrants
never want to go back to their place of origin.
The average immigrant eats more meat, eats more fish, drinks more milk, uses more water and more electricity
than in his place of origin.
However poorly they may live,
they continue to come because they find something more in Lagos than they found at home.
Even in rubbish, some people find something that they couldn't find at home.
A different 2013 study shows that inequalities in rural areas are even greater than in urban areas, and some services reach more people in Lagos.
In Nigeria as a whole, only 25% of children are vaccinated in the second year of their life. In Lagos, 54%.
Tension and aggression are, however, much higher in the city.
24% of women in rural areas
have experienced physical violence since age 15.
In the cities, 33%. In Lagos, 44%.
In the state of Borno, the stronghold of Boko Haram, only 15%.
Concerning religion, the report shows that in Nigeria as a whole, the percentage of women that have experienced physical violence after the age of 15 is 44% amongst Christians and 13% amongst Muslims. US aid, UK aid, the UN Fund for Population Activities, and the National Population Commission of Nigeria have cooperated in this study. At the same time, although the country is supposed to have free, universal primary education,
there are often no schools in the slums where immigrants pile up.
Parents send their children to private schools and pay by the day.
Even the poorest have some disposable income for expenditure beyond survival.
Some indicators show rapid progress across Nigeria.
In 10 years, the use of insecticide-treated nets has spread from 2 to 50% of households.
Female circumcision is dropping fast.
1/3 of women aged 45 to 49 years old have had it in their childhood.
Only 15% of women, aged 15 to 19 years.
3/4 of urban households and half of rural households have access to improved water sources. The rest get their water from sources of unknown quality.
1/5 of urban households and 3/5 of rural households have primitive storage.
That means they use the open countryside or a simple pit as toilet.
The rest use modern toilets, sometimes private, otherwise shared.
An urban majority and a rural minority have electricity.
Television goes with electricity.
A large proportion of the population is illiterate. More women than men.
Many more in the villages than in the cities.
Fewer in Lagos than in other cities.
Far too many in Borno.
Polygamy is an exception.
In most households there is only one wife.
Childhood mortality is much higher in rural areas.
The percentage of undernourished children in rural areas is double that of urban areas.
Nigeria defined in 2010 a poverty line which corresponds in purchasing power to €1 approximately.
If someone's daily consumption is below €1,
he cannot purchase the calories required to feed an average person.
According to the 2013 household census,
1/3 of the population of Nigeria,
that's 60 million people,
live below this poverty line.
Another 80 million live between €1 and €2.
The remaining 40 million belong to the so-called middle class, as defined by the African Development Bank.
They are not, of course, in the middle, but at the top of the social ladder, but it is assumed that anyone spending at least €2 a day
belongs to the middle class.
Out of those 40 million, 25 million spend between €2 and €3 a day. The remaining 15 million start at €3.
That is €540 a month for a typical 6-member family.
And extend to the stratosphere of grand luxury and private jets.
Separate urban and rural curves show around 45% of the rural population in extreme poverty
and around 15% of the urban.
We can guesstimate the distribution of consumption between large sections of the population.
This adds up to €95 billion.
Let's say 100.
Out of the 400 billion of the Nigerian GDP of 2013, 72% went to household consumption. That's 290 billion.
Let's say 300.
Out of those 300 billion, 100 were consumed by 92% of the population, by 165 million people.
And 200 billion by 8% of the people, that is 15 million people.
But even within this group of 15 million people,
there is great inequality because the group has an average annual consumption of €13,000, but starts at €3 a day, which means 1,100 a year.
Therefore, at the top of the top, a couple of million people are having a wild party.
Which explains why Nigeria has a higher consumption of champagne than Russia or Brazil,
and is considered a very dynamic market for luxury goods.
Remember that we are not talking about income, but about consumption. And we are not talking about patrimoine or capital as defined by Piketty.
Income inequality is certainly greater than consumption inequality.
The poor spend all their income, they borrow, they beg, and they steal.
The rich save income and accumulate capital.
Thus rises the need and the ability for the famous or infamous Eco-Atlantic.
Have you seen my beautiful baby? Have you seen my tomato baby? Oh, baby, suffer the cool me temper. Ada,
Future financial city of Africa.
This, will be a landmark because 5 million square meters is not a joke. It's a whole city. New jobs, new opportunities, massive jobs.
New privatized African city heralds climate apartheid. Nigeria's Eco-Atlantic augurs how the super-rich will exploit the crisis of climate change to increase inequality and seal themselves off from its impacts. Behind the project, a politically connected financial empire and a slew of African and international banks.
The Guardian states the obvious, the screaming class characteristics of this private and not privatized city, but misses a crucial dimension. They are investing in Lagos instead of New York or London. This is the news, not that the rich build for the rich.
Eco-Atlantic promises housing for 250,000 rich,
700,000 square meters of office space
for multinationals, bankers and financiers,
autonomous private water supply, sewerage, drainage and electricity,
and 150,000 jobs for the inhabitants of the other Lagos.
What is happening, though, to the other Lagos?
There is much progress, and things are getting worse.
What does this mean?
What does this mean? Lagos adds 500,000 people to its population each year, with zero ability to pay taxes. The state authorities cannot cope.
Lagos generates up to 10,000 metric cubes of rubbish a day.
Only 40% is collected formally.
The state has a housing program.
The cheapest houses cost around 15,000 euros.
They are too expensive for most people.
They deliver 200 houses per month, a drop in the ocean.
Every month we can make 200 people homeowners if they can afford it.
Lagos has a larger population than Greece.
The state's annual budget is of the order of 2 billion euros.
1/30th of the budget of Greece.
The federal budget, for a country of 180 million, is of the order of 20 billion euros.
1/3 of the budget of Greece.
Notice, however, the relationship between current and capital expenditure.
Half the state budget has actually been spent on capital expenditure, and a quarter of the national budget is also supposed to be spent on capital projects.
Under such tight financial constraints, the state government encourages financiers to build their own city
and proudly advertises its achievements in 2013, however inadequate they may be in comparison with existing needs.
Roads,
bridges,
clinics,
schools,
a small energy plant,
sewerage works that have reduced flooding,
renovations that cause great pain.
Informal construction and trade often create suffocating conditions in central nodes of the city.
The state is obliged to intervene. They can neither compensate nor transfer the inhabitants and traders to some other location.
They can only evict them and demolish the illegal structures.
The tension is extreme and sometimes ends in tragedy.
Demolish everything. Where do they want them to go and stay? It's what crime?
The results after innovation are spectacular.
Orderly traffic, proper parking, street lighting, etc.
But a different class of people enjoy them. The very poor have gone somewhere else.
A light rail is under construction in Lagos.
The first of 7 lines is due to be delivered within 2015.
It is funded by the state government with a loan of $1 billion from the World Bank.
The operation, together with the generation of electricity, the purchase and maintenance of the rolling stock, the signalling and the tickets, will be handed over to the private sector.
A minority of citizens will benefit, those that live or work along its path and can pay the ticket.
This first line of this 7-line mass transport system perfectly symbolizes the rise of a middle class and a mass market.
It is a minority today. It is expected to grow into a majority tomorrow.
But let us return to the greater picture for a minute.
It is often said that Black Africa has sent, legally or illegally, 10 euros to the First World for each euro of aid it has received.
We do not have accurate data for these flows, especially the illegal ones, but many analysts have shown that Africa gives, does not receive aid.
Up until World War I, countries like France or Britain, in fact, had a permanent trade deficit with respect to the rest of the world. The rest of the world was working for them, and this was fine because they were receiving capital income from the rest of the world that was much bigger than their trade deficit, so they were able not only to pay for their deficit, but to keep buying the rest of the world. You know, I think it will be a mistake to believe that this only belongs to the past. And, you know, we still have today the situation of entire countries, you know, including in Africa, of course, where national income is a lot less than domestic output, because a big part of domestic output goes abroad.
The national income of Nigeria is lower than its domestic product.
8 or 9% of domestic product goes abroad.
In contrast, many first world countries have a greater income than product.
102% in the US, Germany and France in 2012.
This hemorrhage has nothing to do with public debt. Nigeria succeeded in buying back 90% of its external debt in 2005.
From $36 billion in 2004, its external debt was reduced to $3.5 billion in 2006.
Its overall public debt, including internal and international borrowing, dropped from 64% to 12% of GDP.
In 2013, it stood at 13% of its revised GDP.
Colonialism may have first responsibility for the long-lasting hemorrhage of Sub-Saharan Africa.
Local kleptocrats exporting all they stole abroad also had a major contribution.
A recent United Nations and African Union panel on illicit financial flows, chaired by former South African President Thabo Mbeki, has estimated that Africa has lost through these illicit transactions $1 trillion in the last 50 years, and that it is currently losing about $50 billion a year. This is more than what the African Development Bank estimates is needed annually for Africa to modernize and complete its basic infrastructure over a period of a few years. The study estimates that Nigeria is losing 12% of its GDP and attributes 60% of the total loss to the practices of international multinationals. The top Nigerian kleptocrat was Abacha.
He is said to have looted $5 billion.
Abacha cooperated closely with Shell
in the suppression of the resistance to Shell
of the inhabitants of the Niger Delta.
His greatest achievement, however, is not the theft of $5 billion or the murder of several enemies of Shell.
It is the transformation of the Nigerian National Petroleum Company from a producer to an importer of petrol.
This was in the interests of a local mafia that profited from the legal import and the illegal trade and export of petrol subsidized by the state.
When in 2012 the government attempted to abolish the subsidy,
there were massive protests and the protest movement had at least 10 dead.
This is how the slogans, "Stop importation, make our refineries work," and "Remove corruption, not subsidy," arose.
Shell sold in the summer of 2014 some of its blocks in the Niger Delta
to Nigerian companies.
Nigerian companies have purchased oil blocks in the past, but resold them quickly because they didn't have the financial and technical capacity to exploit them.
They have the capacity today, according to the Financial Times.
Shell and the other oil multinationals are not leaving Nigeria.
They are leaving the troubled Niger Delta, where they're facing costly resistance and theft,
and are escaping from the crime scene of an environmental murder of first planetary order, for which Shell has first co-responsibility, along with NNPC and all kinds of rebels, terrorists and smugglers.
The last major leak was in November 2014. In January 2015, Shell agreed in an out-of-court settlement to pay $80 million to villages affected by some 2008 oil spills. According to a British study, Nigerian oil theft is of an industrial scale. The network of corruption touches the army and the political establishment. As many as 100,000 barrels a day may be smuggled, worth a sum of the order of €2 billion a year, equivalent to the annual budget of the state of Lagos, or 1/10 of the federal budget. Shell itself estimates that the value of stolen oil may exceed €5 billion a year.
Aliko Dangote is the richest man of Africa and the 23rd richest man in the world, according to Forbes.
According to a 2005 classified cable of the American Embassy, included in the WikiLeaks, Dangote was intimately connected with the governments and the wider establishment of Nigeria.
It is publicly known that he funded the electoral campaigns of former President Obasanjo.
His companies represent today 1/4 to 1/3 of the value of the Nigerian Stock Exchange.
The opportunities that we have here in Africa is, I think, second to none.
You've moved up from, according to Forbes, $16 billion last year, now $25 billion. And the big question is, where do you go from here?
The program that we have at the moment is trying, to grow in terms of the group business about 500% in the next 5 years. And we think that by the time that we finish 2017, we should have at least a market cap of about $100 billion. So
annual rate of growth between 30 and 40%.
That we are going to have, refinery with petrochemical, and polypropylene, making tires. Fertilizer will be about 2.8 million tons.
The Nigerian consumption of nitrogen fertilizers is very low.
Next business will be the cement, which by 2016, we're going to be over 60 million tons in the Sub-Saharan Africa. Even this year, we'll be the largest producer of cement in Sub-Saharan Africa, right, with 40 million tons by this year.
If 40 to 60 million tons of cement mean nothing to you, check in the Wikipedia the production of some countries in 2005. Nigeria was producing 2 million tons and Greece 15.
And if the correlation between cement production and economic growth is not clear, check the distribution of world production in 2010.
The Chinese seem to be building something, eh?
In the next 4 or 5 years, there will not be any sugar imports into Nigeria. We're also doing rice, 1 million tons of rice. This will make us to actually employ about 200,000 additional workers, like what you call import substitution. Nigeria imports maybe up to now $1.2 billion worth of milk. Why should we import milk? Why should we import sugar? Why should we import rice? But I think what we need is to have an inclusive growth so that it will trickle down, it won't hang over there. If we want to also live in peace, we need to give something back to people.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Notice the last phrase. He does not say,
if we want to also live in peace, we must give something to people.
He says,
if we want to also live in peace, we must give something back to people.
Thus spoke Aliko Dangote in March 2014.
10 months later, the price of oil has dropped below $50 a barrel.
The national currency of Nigeria has been devalued.
The country's budget has been curtailed.
The forecast annual growth of GDP has lost 1 percentage point.
The Nigerian Stock Exchange and Dangote's companies have lost a quarter of their value.
A difficult conjuncture, but also an opportunity.
Cheap oil and the loss of government revenue make more feasible and more necessary the suppression of smuggling and the raising of some taxes.
Reduced profits from the export of crude oil make other investments more attractive.
Dangote himself is moving ahead with his refinery in collaboration with 2 American companies.
It is expected to start working in 2017.
So what's the overall picture of Nigeria?
An accumulation of capital has taken place, in whatever way it has taken place.
There is rapid population growth and urbanization.
There is massive poverty, unemployment and underemployment.
But there is also a so-called middle class of 40 million people
with a demand able to sustain significant investments.
The people in their prayers
or in their protests,
when begging
or rising up in arms,
are asking for an end to the theft and export of the country's wealth.
And they are looking for work to improve their lives.
How far can they go?
What is the future of Nigeria and of Sub-Saharan Africa? Look at these long-term continental population projections of the UN. By 2100 the world has 2 continents, Asia and Africa. The rest is insignificant. Nigeria is expected to have more than 400 million inhabitants by the year 2050, and to be approaching 1 billion by the end of the century, competing with China for the 2nd largest population in the world. Several studies are forecasting a radical restructuring of world economic power this century. Nigeria is expected to overtake Germany in total GDP, at purchasing power parity, around the middle of the century, and at international market exchange rates, a little later.
In this forecast by British consultants PwC of total GDP in 2050, Nigeria is expected to have the fastest average rate of growth out of the 32 largest economies of today's world. This is Nigeria, this is Germany. Out of the 5.5 percentage points of Nigerian growth, 2.5 are due to population growth and 3 to growth of per capita GDP. In Germany, population growth is negative and the rise of per capita GDP exceeds the rise of total GDP. GDP is divided between fewer people. If the population component is taken out, Nigeria is forecast to grow at 3% and Germany at 2%. The difference could be bigger and has been bigger in recent years. Nigeria could catch up faster, Germany may not achieve long-term 2%. In any case, the Nigerian inefficiencies and obstacles will be overcome one way or another, sooner or later.
Take agriculture. Corn yields in Nigeria today are 1/10 of what they are in France, and of that 1/10, much is lost in inefficient storage and transport. This gap will close. Irrigation, fertilizers, roads, electricity and of course education will reshape the sector. This is what has already started in Ethiopia, which is experiencing startling rates of growth, based on agriculture and construction. And Africa is said to have 60% of the planet's uncultivated arable land.
Take education. In most of Sub-Saharan Africa, the majority of citizens do not speak at home the official language of their country. Children come out of 6 or even more years of schooling with difficulties of comprehension, reading and writing, because schools teach a foreign language, English, French or Portuguese. Electricity and television and urban tribal intermarriage will solve this problem within 1 or 2 generations. The official language will become the home language for many more people.
Take management. Even a casual tourist notices the discipline and organization of Germany, the chaos of Nigeria.
This gap will also close. Uninterrupted electricity supply and reliable transport improve precision and reliability. There is always a big difference between the first generation of peasants migrating to the cities and their children born in a city.
Can Nigeria grow as fast as China?
Probably not. It does not have a political agent like the Chinese Communist Party, a business spirit like that of the Chinese in Hong Kong, or a one-child policy.
Its capital flows are at the mercy of the Fed and the so-called markets, and it is hemorrhaging earned or stolen capital to the first world.
Nevertheless, the fundamentals are so strong that the country will somehow find its path.
And as the economy takes off, international capital will rush to invest in Nigeria as it has done in China. Today China is Africa's largest trading partner, but Europe remains the largest foreign investor. Tomorrow may be different.
Import substitution in agriculture, energy or construction, as envisaged by Dangote, is a first step. Exports other than raw materials will come later. The future of Nigeria and of Sub-Saharan Africa is bright. They will catch up and their economic and geopolitical weight will multiply in the 21st century. The urban markets of Africa are expected to have twice the size of European markets, including Russia, by 2050 and 5 times by 2100. The largest markets will of course be in China, but the fastest growth and the fastest profits will be in countries like Nigeria.